Let us start our lesson today by looking at the causes for the Second World War, or the causes behind the outbreak of the Second World War. But what is this outbreak? Well, like any other conflict, the Second World War also started by a single triggering incident, a particular event which became the immediate cause for the Second World War. People generally tend to focus on this immediate cause, this trigger event. But like we already know, a gun cannot fire as long as the gun is not loaded. Therefore, for the trigger incident to truly cause the outbreak of the war, the situation needs to be present. And that makes up for the various socio-economic and political reasons that push the world to the brink of a war, as it did in the case of the Second World War. This brink is a point of no return, upon which when a triggering incident occurs, it causes the outbreak of the war. So therefore, let us start looking at these various reasons, socio-economic and political, and also look at the immediate cause behind the Second World War as we delve into the various causes behind the outbreak of the Second World War. The first cause which we would be looking at would happen to be the discontentment with the Treaty of Versailles. But what was the Treaty of Versailles? If you remember, the Treaty of Versailles was the primary treaty that was achieved at the end of the Paris Peace Conference. The treaty was signed between the Allied nations and the associate powers on one hand, who won the First World War, and on the other hand was Germany, which was defeated in the First World War. The treaty was signed on 28 June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors, present in the Palace of Versailles in France. Over here you can see the headline of a newspaper after the treaty was signed, which says that treaty signed, war over. Therefore, the Treaty of Versailles effectively brought the First World War to an end. Now, while the treaty was signed on 28 June 1919, the terms of the treaty came into effect a little later, on January 10, 1920. So, who won the First World War? Do you remember? The Allied nations, of course. Therefore, it was these Allied nations who could draft the various terms of the peace settlement, as they were in a higher position to impose these terms. The Allied nations aimed the Treaty of Versailles to achieve and maintain world peace, and to also make sure that a conflict like the First World War never occurs again. But such idealism is often not the reality. What actually happened is that some Allied nations, particularly France, wanted Germany to suffer. France wanted Germany to truly pay back for all the death and destruction which it had caused. Now, while America was against this attitude, it could not do anything to stop such revanchist or revenge-taking attitude to be the spirit behind the drafting of the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, what the French president did is to make sure that such disastrous terms can be included into the Treaty of Versailles, which would humiliate Germany and which would truly get revenge from Germany. Therefore, we can understand that the Treaty of Versailles was not a fair treaty. In fact, it was incredibly biased towards the Allied nations, and it was revanchist or revenge-seeking in nature. So what we see is that the Treaty of Versailles, while it aimed at achieving and maintaining world peace, it lost its sight by being biased and being revanchist. This treaty was imposed upon the Germans. And you can see in this illustration how this imposition came to be. Why do I say that a treaty was imposed? Because you can see how the Allied nations, the big four nations, which is USA, France, Britain, and Italy, they are forcing on Germany. They're spoon feeding Germany the peace terms. And Germany has no other option but to consume the peace terms, as Germany is being held by a firm grasp of the Allied nations itself. The Allied nations are saying, you have got to swallow it whether you like it or not. Therefore, this particular treaty was forced upon Germany. The terms of the treaty that were imposed or forced upon Germany also were incredibly inhumane and destructive. They were particularly targeted at humiliating Germany and to also destabilize Germany altogether. All these reasons made the Germans not consider the Treaty of Versailles as a treaty, but rather as a diktat, which in German means an imposition. Why was this an imposition for them, you may ask? Because the Germans felt that they had no say in the drafting of the Treaty of Versailles. A treaty that was to decide the future of Germany had not a single German representative present while the treaty was being drafted. The representatives were only called to sign the treaty and then asked to leave. So in this illustration again, you can see why the Germans considered this to be a diktat. As you can see, how the allied nations are actually providing the terms of the treaty to Germany, but that terms of treaty, the peace terms, are being provided at the helm of a sword. If the terms are not accepted, the sword will penetrate Germany. Therefore, if Germany does not accept the terms, war will be declared on it again. In fact, the Weimar Republic, which inherited the German state after the First World War, was weak and could not counter the Allied nations. And therefore, it had no other option and was forced to sign the treaty without any other option. All these reasons made the Treaty of Versailles as a diktat for the German public. Now, can you answer this question? What did the Germans call the Treaty of Versailles? Did they call it a decree? Did they call it a diktat? Did they call it a pamphlet? Or did they call it an order? The correct answer is a diktat. But what were these various destructive and humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles? Well, let us quickly review these at once. The first term of the Treaty of Versailles was that the entire blame of the war was put on Germany. Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war, all the destruction and the death caused by it. Therefore, the world now could blame and could personally hold Germany and the Germans responsible for the death of their close ones and also destruction of their property and whatever else is lost as a result of the First World War. Germany also had to hand over the erstwhile former emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II to the Allies alongside any other person who was considered to be a war criminal. The next destructive term were the armed limitations which were put upon Germany. The Treaty of Versailles caused a rapid demilitarization of Germany, where Germany had to reduce its army to a mere force of 100,000 men. This was a 1/10 reduction of the German army. Along with the reduction of the army, Germany also had to give up all its tanks, heavy artilleries, warplanes, and in fact the entire air force was banned. And in the navy, it could only keep 6 battleships. And all the U-boats or German submarines were also banned. The Germans considered the arm limitation to be a castration of German pride, as they associated German manhood or masculinity with Germany's armed strength. Germany also had to face severe reparations or it had to pay war damages, where it was supposed to pay the insane amount of 6.6 billion pounds as war indemnity, particularly to France. This amount made up for 83% of Germany's GDP at this particular time. Finally, Germany also had to cede or part away with a lot of its precious territories. In total, Germany lost about 13% of its European land holdings, along with which it had to part away with about 6 million Germans who once lived in Germany, but with this loss of territory, they now had to go and live in foreign lands. But it was not the loss of lands that was important for Germany, but it was what the lands actually meant for Germany. You see, within this 13% of land holding, Germany actually lost about 15% of their total farming land, 10% of all their industries, along with also losing resource-rich and strategically important territories and regions like the Saar, the Ruhr, and Rhineland. Germany also had to part away with all its colonial interests. As what we understand, the Treaty of Versailles crippled Germany as a nation. What the terms of the Treaty of Versailles actually did was to sow discontentment and bitterness in the hearts of the Germans. Soon enough, the Germans would start to look for ways to get revenge for all the humiliation put upon them. The Allied nations, therefore, could not realize the true damage that they were causing by imposing such a treaty on Germany. In this environment of discontentment rose Hitler. Hitler and his Nazi party had one very clear goal when they were rising up to power, that they want to restore Germany's lost pride, and in order to do that, they want to disregard every single one of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. You can see Hitler's sentiment of disregard of the Treaty of Versailles in a speech he once made. He said that the treaty was made in order to bring 20 million Germans to their deaths and to ruin the German nation. And thus, at the foundation of our movement, or the Nazi movement, lies the urgent setting aside of this dictated peace treaty. So said Hitler. This made Hitler immensely popular among the German public, as Hitler was actively vocal about something which majority of the Germans only secretly imagined to do: disregard the treaty altogether. This particular illustration is a very accurate depiction of Hitler's attitude to the Treaty of Versailles, where we can see that Hitler is simply passing through or is slipping through the Treaty of Versailles because Hitler does not regard for the Treaty of Versailles or its sanctions. Therefore, we understand that Hitler's rise to power is associated and synonymous with Hitler's disregard of the treaty. Hitler considered the Treaty of Versailles and the fact that the Weimar Republic even accepted the treaty as a form of national embarrassment. As already mentioned, the people of Germany loved Hitler's disregard. They considered this disregard to be masculine and bold, as they finally felt that here comes a leader who truly wants to stand for what is good for Germany. Hitler did not want to lose this public image, and therefore he continued on his path of disregarding the treaty. And when he came to power, his first foreign policy decision was to make sure that in all manners possible, Hitler's party and the Nazi government itself happens to disregard the treaty altogether and do everything which the treaty had forbid Germany from doing. Therefore, let us see in what manner did Hitler disregard the Treaty of Versailles altogether and how that led to the Second World War. When Hitler came to power, there began a period of rapid and widespread rearmament in Germany. This, of course, was in complete disregard of the Treaty of Versailles, which had forced armed limitations on Germany. When Hitler came to power, he made military training compulsory and also started a mass recruitment into the German army. Weapon production also found a record high under Hitler, as German engineering was producing deadly weapons of war and weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, we understand that Germany began rapid rearmament with compulsory military training, mass recruitment to the armies, and there also was heavy production of arms and weapons. But Hitler was smart. He knew that if he did all of this at once and all of a sudden, it would cause panic in the hearts of the other European nations, mostly the Allies, and they would declare war on Germany in an instant. Therefore, he made sure that all these developments happened gradually, in a phased manner, and also in relative secrecy or in a concealed manner. The insane war indemnity that was imposed upon Germany also did not last long under the reign of Hitler. You see, Hitler stopped paying the war indemnity slowly and slowly in phases. So every single time Hitler made a payment of war indemnity, he paid a significant amount lesser. Finally, Hitler stopped paying the war indemnity altogether. This is because he passed a law which made sure that the German capital does not flow out to other nations. Quite simply put, German capital could not be given to other nations as forms of loans, and other nations could also not take away German capital as forms of war payments. Therefore, German capital was locked in Germany, and therefore Hitler did not make any more indemnity payments. Hitler was a staunch expansionist, and thus he was sure that he would get back all the territories that Germany had lost, especially after the Treaty of Versailles. In 1923, Hitler managed to get back the Ruhr and the Saar regions from France. The Ruhr region over here was occupied by French forces between 1923 to 25. Hitler managed to get this region back, along with the Saar region over here, which was occupied under the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, we understand that Hitler managed to get back two strategic and resource-rich areas from France. But Hitler did not want to stop here. He knew that German pride was lost the day when the Rhineland region of Germany, an extremely important border region between France and Germany, was demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. And therefore Hitler knew that to restore pride, he had to get the Rhineland back and put his own forces there, which he finally did when he sent his troops to march into Rhineland and effectively occupy it back. Thus we see that Germany recaptured the Ruhr and the Saar regions from France and later even managed to get Rhineland back. All of these, of course, were in direct defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, which actually had taken away most of these regions from Germany. Hitler did not even stop there. He invaded other countries like Czechoslovakia, and he did the final defiance of the Treaty of Versailles when he sent his troops to march into Poland and effectively invade Poland, therefore disregarding the Treaty of Versailles. This German invasion into Poland was considered to be the ultimate disregard of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, such blatant disregard for a treaty that established the power equation in Europe after the First World War did ring bells in other European nations. These acts of disregard actually threatened other nations,